Well, big news of the day, obviously, Volodymyr Zalenskey visited Washington, D.C. yesterday. He spoke before a joint session of Congress last night. This is his first trip outside of the country since the beginning of the Ukraine war that Russia launched in February of 2022, a lot earlier this year. The war has been going on for at least 10 months at this point. It has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. One of the big questions that has arisen, particularly on the right, but also for some people on the left, is why the United States is involved in this in the first place. And the answer is actually multifaceted because foreign policy is a complicated area. So the answer is actually not all that complicated. Russia is a geopolitical foe of the United States. Degrading Russia is in the strategic interest of the United States. Now, there are some people on the right who are very isolationist in orientation, and they're constantly asking why the United States should basically be involved anywhere in the world, which was a fair question in about 1850. It is a less fair question today when obviously global supply chains have to do with international politics, when global economics have to do with international politics, when the ability to move weaponry and troops and terrorists around the globe is very, very easy. We live in a very global society. What that means is that the waters that once protected the United States from all encroachments abroad, those waters look a lot narrower than they did circa about 1850. And what that means is that geopolitically, our foes are either on the move or they are in retreat. The United States is either on the move or it is in retreat. The world is a safer place when the U.S. has more hegemony. The world is a less safe place when the U.S. tends to create a vacuum in foreign policy, which is then filled by geopolitical foes like Russia or like China. What this means on a sort of hard-nosed level is that we do have an interest in degrading Russia's military strength to invade surrounding countries. We have that interest because Russia, again, is a geopolitical foe of the United States that is not interested in forming an alliance with the United States. That has been our foe in Syria. It's been our foe in Afghanistan. It's been our foe repeatedly throughout the world that is hoping to shape a new sphere of influence to activate against the West. Russia is not a part of the West. Russia's been given every opportunity, particularly in the fall of the Soviet Union, to do that. Russia just has not taken advantage of any of that. Russia's goal has been pretty overtly to break NATO. NATO, in the aftermath of the Cold War, was reconstituted as a sort of anti-Russian alliance, knowing that Russia had predatory instincts with regard to the Baltic states particularly, but also with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Poland, with regard to a lot of the former satellites of the Soviet Union. NATO continued to be a viable defense mechanism against the Russians. Now, that doesn't mean that NATO's policy with Ukraine has made any sense. It hasn't made any sense. NATO, which originally was formed with a tripartite purpose, keep the Americans in, keep the Germans down, keep the Russians out, right? That was the tripartite purpose. That continues to be NATO's mission, is to keep Germany at the center of European politics without allowing them to sort of break out, because they've done so twice in the 20th century to the devastation of the world. To keep the Americans in, because America has an interest in European politics, at least to the extent that we send the money. And to keep the Russians out, because again, Russia's predatory instincts were communist, and now they are more oligarchic. So that mission maintains, but that does not mean that NATO wasn't playing games with Ukraine. They kept making overtures to Ukraine. Maybe you should come, maybe you should not come. And finally, Russia got tired of it and invaded. And you see why Putin invaded. Doesn't mean it was justified, but you see why he did it. He also had the bizarre notion that Ukraine was not, at this point, a polity of its own, that it considered itself part of Russia, so he'd be able to walk in just the way that Hitler walked into Austria during the Anschluss, and everybody just cheered. Putin obviously thought that was going to happen in Ukraine. That did not happen. Part of the reason, by the way, it didn't happen is because Russia had invaded the Donetsk-Luhansk region as well as Crimea in 2014 and turned those places into absolute hellholes. So if you're a Ukrainian looking to your east and you look at Luhansk, Donetsk, or looking to your south at Crimea, and you say, I can be living like those people, or I could be living not like those people, the answer is you don't want to live under Russian rule. It turns out that Vladimir Putin's rule has not been good for Russians, and it has not been for Ukrainians inside Luhansk, Donetsk, or inside Crimea. So that miscalculation by Putin has led to an entrenched war in which he has been pretty thoroughly rebutted. The surprise of the war is not only that Ukraine was able to stave off Russia, but the Ukraine has been able to inflict extraordinary casualties on Russia. Now, part of that is because Russia's conventional military is actually incredibly second-rate. Not just their trained soldiers, but also their weaponry. Their weaponry is really old because Russia is a very poor country. I mean, it really is. Russia's GDP total is about the GDP of the state of Florida. Russia is not a rich country. Russia is, as some people have suggested, an oil station with a nuclear arsenal. And because of that, Russia's conventional military was defeated by Ukraine, which was armed with NATO weaponry, which actually is significantly upgraded weaponry over whatever the Russians have to offer. So Russia has been forced back. That is in the interest of the United States. It upholds the deterrent power of NATO. It degrades Russia's conventional military to the extent that Russia is going to have a very tough time with adventurous ambitions in terms of foreign policy and violating other countries' borders, which is good for the world. Stability is generally a good thing. Violation of borders is generally a bad thing. And it deters China as well, because again, the cost that Russia has now borne is so significant that if China is looking at Taiwan and thinking to itself, maybe we will try that, well, looking at what happened to Russia, not wonderful if you're China. Now, China's gotten some side benefits, like namely, it's been able to turn Russia into its giant oil field. Russia's been shipping all of its oil to China. Instead of China once being a client state of the Soviet Union, now Russia is essentially a client state of China. So in some ways, it's maximized Chinese powers, but in other ways, it's actually degraded a very strong strategic ally of the Chinese and made it harder for them to engage in adventurous foreign policy in Taiwan. So the United States has achieved a bunch of interests with regard to the Ukraine war. And as far as the investment that the United States has made in the Ukraine war, again, we've expended no lives in the Ukraine war. We've expended a fair bit of money in the Ukraine war. But the truth is that the amount of money that we have spent in 2022 amounts to approximately 6% of total U.S. defense spending. In 2022, the U.S. defense budget was $715 billion. The amount that we've spent in Ukraine is something like $77 billion. It'll raise to maybe $100 billion. It's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But it represents a fraction of the United States' military budget. If you could trade, say, 10% of the American military budget for the complete degradation of the Russian military, that actually is not a bad move, considering that the Ukrainian armed forces have already killed or wounded at least 100,000 Russian troops. That is half of its original fighting force. There have been almost 8,000 confirmed losses of armored vehicles, including thousands of tanks, thousands of APCs, artillery pieces, hundreds of fixed and rotary wing aircraft, numerous naval vessels. So basically, we've destroyed half of the Russian military by just giving the weapons to Ukraine. So that is a pretty solid return. I mean, the truth is that on a year-to-year level, the amount of money that we'd be spending in the American military budget in order to counter whatever moves the Russians are making would easily be that amount of money. And here you're talking about a one-time expenditure that has taken out an extraordinary percentage of the Russian military. So is it in America's interest to fund this? Sure. Now the question becomes what the end of this war looks like. And this has been my point. The United States and Ukraine had convergent interests when it came to the beginning of this war. Stop the Russians, push the Russians back, degrade the Russian military. Now the question becomes, for how long? What is the end point here? Because the truth is that the United States does have an interest in stability. Despite all of the talk about how we would love to see regime change in Russia, the truth is we don't know what comes next in Russia. And were the Russian regime to fall, what you could end up with, as Henry Kissinger has said, is a complete destruction of any centralized authority in Russia. And now you're talking about an extraordinarily large landmass with tribal situations taking over all over this landmass, armed with 2,500 nuclear weapons. That does not sound like an ideal situation. You actually do need a centralized government in Russia, as much as you think that Vladimir Putin is a thug and a strongman. As much as that is true, the complete collapse of the Russian government into sort of chaos would be a worse solution probably than what we are currently looking at right now. Alrighty, guys, the rest of the show is continuing right now. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be getting into your phone calls, plus an update on Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. I don't care, but you guys apparently do. So we're covering that. Apparently she's now signing a check to Johnny Depp. If you're not a member, click the link in the description and join us.